Well, I think we're about ready to get started, and I think I'm the first thing on the agenda, since Peter has no housekeeping this morning. My slot in this is to sort of take a look back at some of the things we heard yesterday, to reflect a bit on where the discussion has been going, I think I have added to my list of things, I don't know whether it was on Peter's list of what he wanted me to do, to also comment a bit on some of the things that I hadn't heard, as well as some of the things I had heard. So that's what I propose to do in the next 15 or 20 minutes, and then there should be just a little bit of time for some conversation. The first thing I want to note is that there really seem to be two rather different agendas threading through here, and it's worth being clear about them. One is an agenda about what I'd characterize as the commercial marketplace in content. The film industry, the movie industry, the music industry, as we heard yesterday. There are going to be some other sessions looking at other parts of the commercial sector. And some of the questions about the commercial sector that we heard yesterday deal with their business models and how those do and don't fit well with the evolving network environment or the needs of the public and the needs of higher education. There's a second agenda, which also came up yesterday, which really deals with open academic or educational or research content. This is content that is created within the academy. OpenCourseWare is a premier example of this sort of thing, and where the academy is looking to make this material widely available in consonance with the values of the academy. I think it's important to pull these two apart, and in my discussion going forward, I'm going to emphasize the material that comes out of the academy. The first issue, the issue around the commercial market, actually, I think has been much better covered than the question of material arising out of the academy directly. There have certainly been, endless things written, endless meetings on the future of music and alternative economic models. I'd point out that most of the issues around restructuring the commercial market are fundamentally issues of law or public policy or both, and in that sense have a high degree of intractability to them when compared to questions about academic or educational content that's created within the academy, where most of the issues are really policy choices that the academy needs to make rather than legal things that are imposed from elsewhere. And I think that's a very important distinction. I do want to note, and I think this is very important, that the commercial market and the academic market are not discrete. They overlap and intersect in all kinds of interesting and awkward ways. We heard about textbooks yesterday, for example. Textbooks sound like they come out of the academy, but actually are a pretty vibrant commercial market. More problematic, though, I would say, than textbooks, where Fred really, I think, did a wonderful job in his talk of illustrating how textbook strategies are a policy choice within the academy, and that the academy could make different policy choices. Much more problematic are questions, are areas where we need to make use of material from the commercial sphere in the support of research and education. where we need to use it as scholarly evidence for the study of culture, of communication, of politics, of society, of history, where we want to construct documentaries, for example. And I believe there was some mention yesterday of the notorious problems of clearing material for use in documentaries. A great deal of that material is tied up in ways where it just leaves enormous holes in our ability to talk sensibly about the history of our society and our culture for the last 75 years. One of the things that I think it's important to underscore here, too, is that we use the term economics a lot, and the issue is often framed as it's too expensive to clear these rights. Well, that is certainly an issue, but it's not the only issue. We need to remember, in terms of clearing rights and getting permissions, nobody's obligated to provide those. In fact, they're not even obligated to answer your mail asking about them, and they don't in many cases. It's not just a matter of economics, although economics are part of it. It's also a matter of control. Now, there's a lot that we could talk about having to do with this legal and public policy framework around the commercial marketplace. And I don't want to emphasize that there other than, in the sort of theme of if we knew then what we know now, to recognize just how incredibly corrosive the Copyright Extension Act of 1998 has been. I think that many, many people really underestimated how much of a problem that was going to create in terms of locking up material for an extra couple of decades, and in terms of vastly increasing the population of so-called orphan works. There's some reason to be, if not optimistic, at least take some hope from the fact that there is a serious inquiry going on now about open works and how we might mitigate some of the most destructive effects of the Copyright Extension Acts in terms of opening up those orphan works, and I think that's an area that certainly deserves all of our attention. But let me turn specifically to this question of material that's created by the Academy, open content in support of the communication of scholarship, teaching materials, communication of research. Now, one of the things I was very intrigued about is that we saw a little bit of a gap opening up between the notion of open content in the sense of content that's open to be used easily, and I'll return to that point in a moment, and content that is produced through an open process. And I think that's a very interesting kind of a distinction. You see this as well in open source. I mean, open source is both an artifact, but it's also increasingly being used to describe various kinds of community processes for validating, community processes for verifying, sorting out conflicts. We had some discussion about Wikipedia yesterday as one of the ways to think about the future of open content and how it's constructed in a community fashion, this focus on process. And I think it's very helpful, again, to pull these two apart. Studies of process are very different than questions of thinking about what to do with the results. But I think it's important to recognize both questions on the table, because when we talk about economics, the economics of supporting a process are very different than the economics of dealing with a fairly stable and finished result of such a process. One of the things that we didn't talk about there, and that very much weighs on my mind as a difference between these sorts of process-oriented things and very traditional kind of publishing activities, is the question of sort of ongoing obligations, responsibility, and expectations of interaction that fall upon authors. One of the things that's very interesting to me is that as an author, you can write an article or even a book and kind of be done with it. It's done, it's finished, it's out there. You may get an occasional letter or other communication from someone correcting something, and you can often deal with it by simply saying, if I ever return to that topic and do a second edition, I'll certainly think about how to incorporate this. There are expectations of completely open-ended interaction and responsibility in the digital environment. I'm particularly, intrigued when we look at things like Wikipedia, where they talk about pages being changed and other people are tracking these pages they wrote so they can go back and correct the changes if they're kind of inaccurate or if they don't agree with them. And this leads to a kind of a world where you never finish with anything. I do wonder a little bit about the implications of that for scholars going forward, about how hard it is to move on to a new topic. I think that bears some thinking about. One of the questions that we have begged, and I think it's very important to directly address, is the meaning of open when we talk about open content. This is one of the slipperiest issues that I've seen, and it's one that I'm increasingly coming to believe is going to be absolutely crucial to sort out. The first bias on open content, I think, goes back to the open access movement and things of that nature, and very much equates open content to people can go and read it without charge, and maybe even print a personal copy or download a personal copy. But fundamentally, it's about human beings reading without charge, without barrier. Now, when we look at the world that's evolving, the digital world, when we look at the changing social practices, we see a whole pile of things that go far beyond reading. We see the remix culture that Larry Lessig has talked about and that was alluded to yesterday, the desire to creatively remix and reuse materials in digital form. This makes many authors, many creators, academic and otherwise, very nervous, even if they are sympathetic to open access. But I would suggest that it doesn't stop even there. My view is that we are starting to see the emergence of tools that compute on bodies of literature, and we're very unclear about computational rights over literature, particularly when you might have to aggregate huge amounts of literature locally to compute on it in a reasonable way. What does it mean? We use this notion of derivative works in copyright law for things that are remixes or translations or other kinds of things derived. What does it mean if you take, for example, the entire corpus of biomedical literature, run a program that computes over it while simultaneously consulting some private data that you've developed experimentally, and spits out some conclusions? Is that a derivative work? And if so, does that mean you need permission from every author who ever wrote an article about the life sciences that's still within copyright? If it does, then, my reading is that that's basically said that text mining is a technology that's dead on arrival, that it's going to become completely intractable for the use in settings outside of things like the intelligence community where they, can sort of override some of these details. I think we really need to think about this kind of computability on objects. There's another thing that's related to computability, and that's preservability. If we are really talking about open content that needs to last in the long term, we need to be able to transform it for preservation purposes, to replicate it, and to rehost it in many cases. It's interesting to me that many of the early recommendations to authors about maintaining their rights and giving minimum kind of rights to publish things don't really take into account the rights that are needed in order to make sure that their material gets preserved. That's quite a striking oversight in my view. So I think that this question of what do we mean by open content, what are our sort of norms there, is one that really benefits from considerably more exploration of its nuances and implications. Let me turn to economics for a minute. We've had some discussion of economics. I would say much of the discussion is more about what things cost and why they're so expensive, rather than in terms of, what are the economic models for generating support. I just want to comment on 3 issues in this area briefly. One is friction and overhead. I am very concerned about the development of models that, on the one hand, have the advantage of sustaining something by collecting little fees from many people, but on the other hand, introduce enormous overhead. This is a trap that's very easy to fall into, where something is 3 times as expensive as it needs to be in order to make it self-sustaining. We've seen that again and again, and in the world of the academy, a lot of that overhead translates to lost opportunities. It's basically largely taken out in opportunity costs. The costs of clearing permissions and passing around $25 and $50 checks. I think that we need to take a very rigorous kind of a view about friction and overhead in the system and where we want it, where we don't want it. I think that another thing we need to be thoughtful about is dealing with the paradox of free things that are valuable. We have a lot of trouble with this in the academy, especially around content. We pay so much for certain kinds of content that we have an intuitive sense that, wow, we're paying a fortune for that. It must be valuable. We're not paying at all for this other resource. So how do we, weigh its value against these commercial goods? I think this is particularly striking in, again, areas like preservation and stewardship, where we tend often to focus on, well, gosh, we paid so much for this, we better take good care of it, rather than these are important, wonderful gifts that belong to the whole community, and we need to play our part in making sure that someone takes care of them. I don't know quite how to solve that paradox, but I think it's a paradox we need to be mindful of. The last comment I'll make about economics, and it leads me into my final remarks, was a sort of a chilling exchange that I heard yesterday in the discussion, I believe, following the presentation on university presses. And it went sort of like this. Well, isn't communicating scholarship one of the core functions of the academy? When we point to the missions of the university as being teaching, research, and public service, wouldn't this qualify on all three counts as a core piece of the mission? Shouldn't we be doing a lot of this just out of sort of core operating funding? And the response basically was philosophically yes, but there are an incredible number of competing demands on that core funding within our universities. That, I think, was a very, very important exchange and one that we need to pay attention to. I am aware in Europe of a number of policy conversations that have taken place at major universities there where they have basically put it to the university faculty and administration, is part of our mission the dissemination and preservation of knowledge explicitly, and have answered that question affirmatively, and basically are taking steps to direct resources and set priorities and develop academic cultures on those campuses that are consistent with that. I don't know where we are on that in the United States, but it seems to me that this is part of a fundamental conversation that we have to have about the economics of open content that is produced in support of teaching, of scholarship, of research, of public service. Yes, there are many claims on those core funds, but it seems to me that the preservation and dissemination of that kind of knowledge ought to be one of the claims that truly is strongest. And I think we need to examine and, where appropriate, make that case within the funding environment. That takes me to the last kind of observation that I'll make, which is that I think that we heard yesterday a number of presentations that implicitly or sometimes explicitly framed the question about moral imperatives versus economics. We're at a very strange point. You know, people have dreamed for centuries about the notion of, all knowledge available to all of humanity, of our cultural record being preserved, being comprehensive, being universally available. And technically, we're at the point where we can pretty much do this. Yes, we had some, I think, sobering reminders about the problem of getting adequate bandwidth into some of the poorest parts of the globe. But technically, we are at the point where we can largely do this and are going to get ever more capable of doing this. There's a whole lot of economic reasons and political reasons and other kinds of reasons why we can't do it or we shouldn't do it or we're prevented from doing it. But increasingly, I think we are going to face this tension between the sort of, idealistic moral imperatives and the, practicalities of economics and of existing interests and how those existing interests need to be appeased in order to make any kind of progress at all. I think it's actually helpful occasionally to frame that in reasonably stark terms, because I think it does help us to understand the very conflicted feelings that many of us have about this as we look at it from different perspectives, and to also understand the very conflicted public opinion around some of this. The fact that it almost seems like we have two regimes overlaid on each other here that are not just inconsistent, but come from completely different planets, and where it's very hard to have crossing conversations. So those are some of the things that really struck me in listening to the talks and the conversation yesterday. I hope maybe they will give us some vectors for continuing the conversation today. Thanks. Any comments and questions? Oh, there are a few surfacing.
Thank you, Peter. Clifford? David Leroff, WGBH. Thank you for that. I'm not in academia, clearly, but this question about the obligation of the Academy to extend public service and to engage is a debate which has been going on for some years, and I'm aware that there was a major initiative funded by the Kellogg Foundation over many years called the Engaged University. And this seems to be another reflection of that debate. And as I recall, at the risk of being overly simplistic, the dilemma was that for individual faculty there was no incentive to public service. There were incentives for teaching, there were incentives for publishing, but the public service role was something that those in the extension division saw as their role, and it wasn't organic within the institution itself. And I'm wondering, for those who are involved in academia, whether that's still an obstacle to realizing the fulfillment of that role as you've defined it so well.
It's certainly an obstacle. But I think that the situation is enormously varied across institutions and across disciplines as well. I think that some institutions have really very explicitly defined assorted kinds of public service as a priority. As part of their mission, and have done things to try and drive that into the incentive system in various ways with varying degrees of success. I think that some disciplines are a lot more committed to outreach than others. So I guess I see it as kind of a complicated and uneven landscape, but one where this certainly is an obstacle. One of the things, though, that's striking is that when we start looking at the ability of the networked environment to allow researchers to communicate with other scholars and at the same time let anybody else who's interested look in at almost no marginal cost, you see what's perhaps a little bit more alignment or confluence between public outreach and the actual conduct of scholarship than has been the case in the past.
I actually want to comment on just this colloquy that you just had. It seems to me that the biggest service mission of the Academy is actually to figure stuff out and pump it out into the world, to learn what we learn and teach it to everyone. And so the Engaged University projects of various kinds sometimes work, sometimes are totally opaque to and orthogonal to what the faculty is up to. But if the faculty does things like Eric von Hippel's project that he talked about yesterday, that's exactly what we ought to be doing. It affects the way lots of people act. And I really do think there is now this consonance. So I believe that scholarship The imperative of scholarship is to share the material with absolutely everybody who wants to see it, and there should be no conflict there. We can quarrel, and I'll probably talk a little bit later, about whether university presses as currently constructed are the best mechanism for doing that. But it's not because they're too expensive. That if they were merely expensive but the cheapest way to get scholarly information out, then it would be a moral imperative of universities and the academy to support them lavishly. Sometimes I think that they're the most interested in old models of copyright of any entity in the world, and that's not so good, perhaps.
Yeah. Just one quick comment on that. One of the areas that I didn't get into, just in the interest of time, is the whole set of ancillary activities around our universities, and that would include university presses, it would include university museums, and it would also include the public broadcasting operations that are associated historically with many of, particularly our public universities. I think in all of those cases we face some hard questions about consistency of mission at this point.
I just wanted to comment that if you look at universities across the board, not just the parts of the university that produce theoretical knowledge, but the applied schools, most of the applied schools have missions that are directly related to the world and actually use the world often as a place to do either testing, but they also see themselves as effectively engaging in interventions in the world. So if you look at schools of social work, international and public affairs, medicine, dentistry, nursing, public health, journalism, all of those schools are dynamically connected usually to their immediate community environments and often extended environments in very aggressive and deliberate ways. And that's a different kind of knowledge transmission. It's embodied in practice, but nonetheless, I think it completes a view of the landscape of the university.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have some over here, Peter.
Just a couple of comments, one narrow and one much too broad, about I think, wonderful presentation of the way in which the topic of this conference fits into things more broadly. One just comment about the public face of the academy, and one of the things that one can try to take advantage of in terms of opening information outside of the individual university is that most academics who do publish have very little economic goals in mind. What they have is the hope, if they write a book, that someone will read it. And if ever I've written a book, and I've written several, I buy copies and I send them to people. And in fact, one of the biggest payoffs in academia I've now seen among my colleagues is not the money you make from writing something. Now the coin of the realm is how many times you are mentioned in Google Scholar. And we then look at so-and-so we want to hire because there are 3,000 mentions and so forth. So that's a way in which the academics are motivated to get their material out, and that's something you want to catch on to as much as possible. The other comment is very, very broad, and I say this from the point of view of not a librarian, which I am in one hand, but as a political scientist who spent a lot of time talking about writing about the nature of American society and how public policy is made. How much of what you said about this domain of activity in the United States is paralleled by so many other things that go on. If you were to get up and give a talk about the nature of the health system, you would be talking about the same set of institutions, powerful economic resources, a set of doctors who have both economic interests but a public service interest, complicated public policy that's dominated in part by the economic interests and the pharmaceuticals. It's just, this is just a side comment. It is fascinating the way in which this all plays out within the structure of the American economy, public policy, legal system, and moral values. So I just want to say that I thought this was a very incredible presentation.
Thank you.
Well, we always expect that of Clifford. I actually was when I was very, very young, the 1976 Copyright Act was shaped and passed, and a lot of effort went into making sure that there was a balance between the rights of copyright owners, intellectual property owners, and the Academy in particular. Over the years, that has obviously decayed, and I was struck by yesterday's presentation, the last presentation of the day, which was entirely about what it takes to preserve existing business models. Mm-hmm. And I often find myself these days in conversations not about how to make the system work for the Academy, but how to preserve existing publishing business models. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there's very little evidence, if any, that that's a worthy effort. I mean, business models come and go, right? And there's also been a lot of talk at this meeting about the responsibility of individual faculty members to change their behavior. But I'm wondering if you could comment, Clifford, on what universities ought to be doing. This changed environment has emerged quite rapidly. I mean, it's really only within the last several years, and even as we speak, university libraries are canceling print subscriptions in favor of electronic subscriptions, which means that the ownership of the record of scholarship is essentially going into private hands. So what should universities do to step up to bringing that record of scholarship back into the domain that supports higher education and the Academy?
That's a really, complicated and many tentacled question. I think that one piece of it obviously is to try and get things right within the sort of scope of the scholarly record that's generated and managed by the universities. I'm actually pretty optimistic there. I mean, I'm painfully aware of the economic pressures that have characterized the the evolution of the scholarly publishing framework, particularly over the last 25, 30 years. But I think that there's enough control and enough sort of shared values around that we are slowly and painfully sorting that one out. And I actually think if we keep at it in another, 10 years, that area is going to look reasonably manageable. It's still going to be a source of big investment, but I think we will be able to preserve it. I'm pretty worried about whether we're going to be able to compute on it adequately, because I think that this just was absolutely off the radar for so many years, and I don't know how we're going to go back and sort out all the old licenses and copyright agreements. It's going to be a lot like the problems I think that showed up where in the time before, when a license agreement added language to cover or to be, moved into any technology yet to be invented sort of thing. And so you had these masses of copyright transfer agreements and licenses that were simply silent and ambiguous on the question of could you do something with it electronically. I fear we've got another one of those coming, only worse. But beyond that, I think we will ultimately be okay on the scholarly literature. I think the preservation issue is a very real one. But I hang on to the fact that even the commercial publishers seem to readily recognize that if you're going to produce something that is credible as a scholarly journal, you better be able to tell a credible story about how it's going to be preserved. Otherwise, you will not be able to attract authors over time. And I think that will sort out. I think we're actually going to have more trouble with some of the scholarly societies, honestly. I think the harder part of the question you raise is how the academy, how universities should be expending whatever public policy capital they have, whatever capital they have as public opinion shapers and leaders, as people, I don't know where the phrase came from, who speak truth to power, as it were. How much of that they should try and expend on getting into this kind of broader question of the intellectual property system outside of the preserve of academia, and particularly the consumer part of it. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer to go and make the case that we need certain exemptions in order to conduct scholarship and preserve the cultural record. Who speaks for the consumer and whether universities should step into that role? They have, in effect, been doing a bit of that for the last 20 years in the copyright debates is less clear to me, and I think it's a hard question. I think I should move on here because I've already managed to, after telling Peter I hoped I could leave us on schedule, set us with a time deficit. Thanks again.
Panel up to the podium. You know who you are. Ellen Dunlap is actually just a few blocks away. This is just for the labs. She's driving in from University Snow or whatever. Do you want to decide who goes first? Should we have a British perspective? You want to go on first? Okay. Your view from
Right. Excuse me, everyone. Okay. Right, everyone. I'm afraid I'm about to start. Sorry to break up your conversation, which I'm sure is going to be much more interesting than listening to me, but there we are. If I can just introduce myself, I'm David Dawson. I seem to have two jobs at the moment, which is a bit unfortunate. I'm head of digital futures at the Museums, Libraries and Archives Council in the UK. Now, it's rather like the IMLS in the United States or CHIN in Canada, so it's sort of an equivalent. I'm also, at the moment, seconded to work with our Department for Education and Skills through half of my time at the moment. But today I have the hat of MLA on rather than the hat of DFES. I've brought some publications with me that I'll put on the front desk for you, and one of them is an executive summary of the DFES's e-strategy for education in the UK, and I think should make some interesting reading. Okay, with that brief introduction, I've just said about the MLA, National Development Agency. You can see all the usual stuff. Just to show you where we sit in government, which is that we are under we're a body underneath the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which I think is quite an interesting little title there. And we sit alongside other organisations that look after English heritage, a bit like the National Park Service here, National Museums, British Library, and so on and so forth. And that also includes the DCMS's responsibilities for the BBC. In terms of open content in a very generic sense, I wish that Creative Commons had been invented earlier, because it would have made my life so much easier in the past. We advised one of our lottery distributors on a major funding program of something like $80 million, which had the proviso that content had to be free at the point of use in schools, libraries, and through an internet portal called the National Grid for Learning. If we'd have had Creative Commons, maybe we could have applied it for that, but unfortunately that didn't work. Just to give you one example of a project that's quite interesting in the context of the discussions today is that of the British Pathé. This is 6,000 hours of newsreel footage dating from the 1896, so it says here, through till the 1960s. And this was digitised and has been put up online and is available free at relatively low resolution. And there's also screen grabs taken, chunks through it. And the interesting thing is that as a business model, as well as being free at the point of use at this relatively limited resolution, the archive is also available on a commercial basis for higher quality video, for streaming, and for download, and also for use by the media industries. And I gather it's roughly paying its way, or in fact slightly better than paying its way, in terms of covering its ongoing costs. So quite an interesting success story there. On a slightly wider tack, we work with a wide range of organisations in the UK, one of which is the JISC, Joint Information Systems Committee, which looks after computing in the higher and further education sectors. And they're investing about £10 million at the moment in a range of projects. I'm just going to highlight 6 of them. I won't go through them in detail, but they're projects that are being funded and will be available in the public domain. So they're being funded by higher education, but with a view to them being available much more widely. So, for example, the British Library sound archiving, sound recordings will have access to UK institutions for some content that can't be rights cleared, and other copyright recordings will be publicly available. And News Film Online, which is 3,000 hours from the Independent Television News and Reuters Television, which will be, again, unfortunately available only for UK institutions. And then Medical Journals back files, which will link to PubMed Central, for example, which will be entirely free access in the public domain. So we're able, in the UK, to make some resources available in the very near future. And I suspect there may be more to come where that came from. Another major initiative is that of the Creative Archive. Now, this is aimed at making primarily moving image materials available for non-commercial use. The project was initiated by the BBC, and the partnership includes a semi-commercial broadcaster, Channel 4, Teachers TV, which is backed by the Department for Education and Skills, the Open University, and I'm sure my colleagues can tell you much more because I haven't got a clue what they're doing with it, and the British Film Institute. And MLA has been asked to join the partnership to represent a wider range of museum, library and archive content. And just to show you where this is coming from, you see at the top it says find it, rip it, mix it, share it. So it's very much about making content available under a version of a Creative Commons license. Remember that Creative Commons is itself available under Creative Commons. The idea is that the license has been adapted for these particular contexts. In this case, you can see in the middle of the screen, the key points are no commercial use, share alike, giving credit, giving attribution, and then come the slightly more tricky ones. No endorsement. That means if someone uses the material in another context, it doesn't mean that the BBC, the BFI, or MLA support the context in which it's been used. And then lastly, the difficult one, which is UK only, because this content has been paid for by UK licence fee payers and taxpayers. So there's some areas around that I don't quite understand, so this may or may not necessarily apply to all the content. So this gives you an indication. And just to give you a few examples here, this is a series of clips that have been released by the BBC under this Creative Archive licence. As you can imagine, it's relatively easy to clear clips that are of animals, because they don't have agents. News film, because you do the rights as you go along. But when you get into drama, documentaries and so on, it gets rather more difficult. And the BBC and others are talking to various people about clearing the rights for this sort of use. But when you start to look in the small print, then the model is quite clear, is that people are able to use the material in commercial contexts and can then license the content through the BBC's motion gallery, which is for documentaries. So, for example, here you can use a clip of the skyline of Boston, which is rather nice. But a slightly different model seems to be applying in Channel 4. And again, I'm not quite clear exactly how they're using it, but one of the things they are doing is encouraging people to submit 4-minute documentaries that they've filmed themselves, put them onto the Channel 4 website, and then they're reviewed by their commissioning editors. So the potential is there for documentary makers to either have their material broadcast, the Channel 4 has done that before, has taken this sort of material and broadcast it, or to use the talent and to get them to shoot new documentaries on a commission basis. So it's a way of finding talent. And also it's a vehicle for people to publish their documentaries and to get them available through something like Channel 4, which is then in the media spotlight. And then, I'm sorry about the quality of the picture. This was, I seem to have timed it wrongly when I did the screen grab. But Teachers TV is aimed at being a resource to support teachers in their learning in the classroom. So it's, if you like, it's continuing professional development. So there's a whole bunch of programs being created around the curriculum, support materials for special education needs. You name it, there are TV programs there, all of which are viewable and downloadable through the Creative Archive license. So again, those could be picked up in a variety of contexts. So, for example, there is a whole series of programs on how teachers can use museums. Now that, to us, is really interesting because it shows museums how to work with teachers at the same time. So it means we can use this material without going to Teachers TV and clearing the rights for each time. This is operating in quite an interesting context in the UK because there's a lot of debate around the future of public service broadcasting in a converged environment. We will be switching over from analogue to digital, which will completely change the current environment where you have 5 terrestrial channels and then digital ones. And increasingly, everything is moving to digital. And at the moment, only the terrestrial broadcasters have any requirement for public service. So everyone is thinking how this will apply, not this time round, but in 2012. And the discussion is already going on that other broadcasters could be commissioned to provide public service content. And an obvious question for me is, where is culture.tv? We have Teachers TV, where's Culture TV? But then, looking a bit more at the word economics, and I think this is potentially quite interesting, is the model that I think in the UK is slightly different to that here, where we have a Department for Culture, Media and Sport, who have a contract essentially with our finance department, the Treasury, which is around public service agreement targets. There's all sorts of things that DCMS funds which go on, but this is the bit of the contract which DCMS has signed up to for, I think it's 2003 to 7, if I remember rightly. So these are the things which need to change over and above what is already happening. And these are the 4 bits of that contract. Engagement in sport by children and young people, take-up of culture and sport, improve productivity, improve value for money. But to give you an example, one of the measures is to attract a total of 500,000 visits to regional museums by new users, predominantly from social class C2DE and ethnic minorities. So that's what we have to deliver through some of our funding programs. Thankfully, we have already achieved that with a couple of years to go. But the interesting thing is that those measures are based very much around the real world, not around the online world. And so these things don't quite match somehow to how we should be acting and how we will be acting in the future. So the take-up of culture, for example, doesn't specifically include online users. That's interesting. The website visitors count in value for money, but that's not the one that the directors of institutions focus on. They focus on the real-life visitors and outreach programs, not on website visitors. And the government statistical categories, which look at defining the creative industries, don't really reflect the importance of the digital industries. In the list is not the UK games industry, for example, which is a major export earner. So these things don't quite match somehow. And then I want also to turn to Europe, because I was unfortunate not to run fast enough when our Department for Culture, Media and Sport was looking for someone to help coordinate European cultural content creation. I ended up being the representative for the UK. And some of you will know that we had the presidency of the UK, which ended in January. And in that, we launched a digitisation action plan. Now, in itself, it's an action plan of experts, not of national governments. But it's quite interesting because we talked about a digital library for European culture, European cultural information space, all the same sort of thing. But there's a huge amount of discussion going on at the moment about a European digital library. The initiative was led by France, kicked off by France. There's been a letter signed by 6 heads of state. 19 national libraries have committed to it. There's some link here to some major digitisation initiatives in the US. I can't imagine which they are. And it's part of the EU's strategy for the information society. It's all about quality of life. And this is the Commissioner for Education and Culture launching it. What's really interesting is that there's a consultation process going on. I won't explain the questions, but I'll just cycle through them. You can read them. Where there are 8 questions that have just been asked of people. Although in theory it's Europe, in fact, the Commission is quite happy to take responses worldwide. And if you look at the questions, they really are quite interesting. What it's suggesting is essentially a root and branch approach to how intellectual property works and how things could be made to work better for users and also to build strong content industries. Because one of the interesting things is I've also been talking to for example, the head of European Publishers Association, we were talking, and she said, what we really need is a new model for public library lending for the internet age. And I hardly knew what to say. It wasn't exactly what I was expecting. But what it means is that publishers are recognising that things need to change. Public library, the idea of borrowing books, has a really powerful impact upon sales. They know that. So it's how we find models that work, that suit everybody. And this one, how can public domain be made more transparent and more widely known in order to facilitate its online availability? The economics of open content. So the consultation closed on Friday, but the Commission told me that they would be very happy to accept any comments that anyone has for the next week or two. If anyone's interested, I can supply further information. But what we also had was, this is a photo of the European Ministers of Culture. One country was missing, but that's 24 of them, plus the states that will be joining, who discussed this for an hour and a half under the presidency of the UK. That's our culture minister just over there. And it was fascinating because huge support for this European Digital Library. At the same time, huge recognition that IPR, as it stands in the European Copyright Directive, was a huge barrier and that we need something that's smarter. Okay, that's everything I wanted to say. As I say, I've got some leaflets I'm going to leave outside, and very happy to answer questions and talk to people over the breaks. Thank you.
used to be a librarian.
So did I.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kati Geber. I'm with the Canadian Heritage Information Network. I'm currently responsible for research and business intelligence. And as it is probably obvious, English is not my first language. What I'm going to do today is to discuss and describe you an organization which is called the Canadian Heritage Information Network. But before doing that, I would like to do some introductory points and to make some comments on our discussions yesterday and maybe add some views from our point of view. We discussed a lot yesterday about openness. We considered openness as open access to content, and also we discussed about some rights issues. But I would like to say that probably, at least from our point of view, we should add other points to the concept of openness. And for example, one of them is openness to change. Openness to change is an attitude. It is a response to conditions outside the established boundaries. The understanding and the reaction to conditions outside boundaries is one of the main components of openness. Also, openness to information leads to adaptation and learning. And from here we can go on and discuss about the role and the importance of the concept of learning organizations. At this point I would like to say that openness includes also an understanding of cross-disciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. We touched upon this yesterday when we discussed convergence issues. But I think that we have to add a bit to the discussion the whole issue of interdisciplinarity and convergence. We conducted studies related to the way roles of libraries, museums, and archives cross today. One of the key events and discussions which influenced our thoughts regarding the transdisciplinarity issue and its relation to openness was a meeting in 1995 in Brussels, organized by Free University in Brussels, in Belgium. The meeting was called Einstein Meets Magritte. The organizers were saying that where Einstein meets Magritte, there is some significant clue that might reveal us the changes and where we are where we are evolving. The way they described the event was the main question of the event, and the way they described it was, how does science confront art? Do we have to oppose life within object, the conscious ordering of physical and social world symbolized in Einstein, to a form of life beyond object symbolized in the imagery of Magritte? And the last point I want to make today is, before I start the description of my organization, is that the virtual museum is not a museum. And here I would like to refer to what Chris Batt said on the occasion of one of our meetings, which is very relevant to our conversation, I think. The virtual museum or the virtual library is a term like horseless carriage. It tells us a bit about the past, but it is ignorant about how it creates the suburbs and global warming. We don't know what the virtual museum or the virtual library will become, but we do know already that it is a hybrid, and that for the museum community or library community coming to terms with foregoing issues of access, traditionally library concerns, it is critical and a bit scary. So with this note, I would like to say that the Canadian Heritage Information Network is not a museum, is not a library, and it is not an archive. It's a network. It's a network of over 1,200 museums participating with an expertise in enhancing the capacity of heritage professionals to create, present, manage, and preserve Canada's digital heritage knowledge. And our vision is to connect audiences with audiences and with their heritage, history, languages through engaging online tools. And also to advance the capacity of the heritage professionals through collaborative research and online development tools. We call ourselves today enablers. So we define our role in the network as enablers for the use of heritage content in various contexts, mainly in education, but we are looking for the use of our content in cultural tourism and generically in civic life. We're enabling public engagement and participation through research, analysis, and understanding our audiences. And the last thing, which is also very important for us, innovative partnerships and collaboration. CHIN was created in 1972 as a reaction to a UNESCO resolution on the protection of cultural mobile objects. The first focus of the network was on creating open content. It was a central repository. The model was the creation of a central repository open to all the members to use. Members from the beginning were both producers and users of content. And these collaborative models enabled the member institutions to share, interact, and solve problems together. And the lack of distinction between producers and users had a positive impact and a longer-term impact on the sustainability models. And if you wish, I can elaborate later on that. So, in 1995, there was a shift in our organization with the advent of information technology and the web. The central repository, the maintaining of the central repository for the protection of the object was no longer our objective, couldn't be our objective. We decided to decentralize, repatriate the descriptions of the objects to the museums. But in the same time, we decided to reuse the information, repurpose the information, complement the information with other data elements, and to post it online to increase to open access. So our focus became, at that time, open access. So we started to describe ourselves as a meta center, and the concept is described in various papers you can find online. And what we started to notice very interestingly is that the moment we enabled open access, the content was of interest not only to the professionals, but also to general public. So at that point, the user became the center of our attention, and our processes focused more and more on cognitive factors. That was the point we started to look at presentation issues, interfacing issues, design thinking, and so on. And of course, the focus was, as I said, on access and dissemination. So what we have become was a networked organization where members, content producers, and users intersect with no arbitrary distinction between collaboration, contribution, and use. The result was the creation of the Virtual Museum of Canada, which is a collaborative arrangement among 1,200 Canadian museums and the Canadian Heritage Information Network. The Virtual Museum of Canada is a heterogeneous space with various models of collaboration and presentation. But it's mainly focused on dissemination and open access. And what we have seen in time is that the virtual exhibits, one of the main components of the virtual museum, where more and more, instead of replacing or representing physical spaces, started to work and to create an interspace, the virtual and physical together. They started to complement the physical activities and to be materials for pre-visits or post-visits in museums. We have conducted awareness studies, and what we found out that 75% of the museum goers today in Canada start their visit online. Also, we have passed the critical point when museums considered the online, the exposure online of their materials as a danger for decreasing the number of physical visits, the visits to the door. On the contrary, we have evidence that the online exposure of materials increases significantly the visits to the door. At that time, we experimented a lot with the branding issues, and we attached, as you can see, a very strong brand to all the materials produced under the flags of the Virtual Museum of Canada. And this was very important because this brand signified quality, and teachers and students were coming to the Virtual Museum of Canada with a specific intention to use the material in their learning activities. The Virtual Museum of Canada, the content providers and the content creators for the Virtual Museum of Canada were larger museums, and they were mainly museums. We were interested to include among the creators also members also users, also members of the general public. And for this, we created a new program which was called Community Memories, which was addressed to small communities in Canada, small community museums in Canada, which were asked to work with their communities, the members of their communities, to identify stories and interesting topics for the community and create together a virtual exhibition and stories. So Community Memories is a kind of a story space, virtual exhibition space, and in the same time, the architecture enables the creation of a digital library which enables use and reuse of the content. And with this, I would like just to give you a couple of numbers to show you magnitude and extension of impact and use. We had over 9 million visits in 2005 from 170 countries. And we have around 7,000 feedback messages databased and analyzed from our users, unsolicited feedback messages. And just quickly about the resources, around 500 virtual exhibits, 4.4 million artifacts, descriptions. The image gallery contains over 4,000 images freely available on the web, educational resources close to 1,000, and so on. Most of the material is in English and French. And around the business model and the business issues related to open access, what we defined was that we defined Chin as the manager and the executive producer of the online resource, of the virtual museum as a whole. Museums are responsible for creating the content. Proposals for exhibitions are chosen by an independent board. And the museums must match virtual museum investment by providing in kind. What we do, we invest, we create contracts with our museum members. And the contract has to be, and based on the contract, the museum has to deliver, the museums, most virtual exhibits are created by collaboration. So the museums collaborating on a virtual exhibit must deliver in time and what the contract describes. Regarding copyright issues, museums are required to clear copyrights for all content. Also, the investment amount includes amount for rights clearance fees, and this has educational effects, of course. Copyright in exhibitions and underlying work are maintained by original rights holders without assignment to CHIN. So, as you can see, the model is distributed, and also the rights are shared. If you want more details on copyright issues, my colleague Rina Pantaloni, who negotiated the copyright and created the whole the guidelines for our copyright policies, is here in the room, and she can talk about it more, and you can ask her questions. At that time, I was responsible for architecture and design at CHIN. In 2005, our new priority became user engagement and participation. And this was based mainly on a study we conducted, the Virtual Museum of Canada, The Next Generation. And it's a co-study with the participation of Steve Dietz, Howard, who is here, Anne Borda, and Pierre Levy. And what we found is that we should focus on developing on a lively communication platform that provide access, communication, and social spaces to meet audiences' needs to collect, relate, create, and donate activities. A platform that encourages individual points of view but provides access to usable authoritative information as the audience desires. So now we started to try to understand what do we really mean by user as participant. And based on our research, we understood that the models for participation are endless, and we don't know exactly what is the impacts, how to enhance, how to create the environment for participation, how to collect and what to preserve as a result of the interaction and participation with users. What we did and what we are launching this year is to create a museum learning space, which is a collaboration between museum educators and teachers for the creation of content. The teachers are defining the needs and the demands and are the innovators, while the museum educators are contributing with content and participating in the creation of content with the materials available in the museums. And after that, teachers can work with their students in the space, and they have various tools for developing new content, repurposing content, and encouraging the students to create and use museum content in their learning processes. Another project is Museum Knowledge Exchange. So, as I said before, we had the CHIN professional site with professional materials addressing the heritage professional needs. What we are experimenting now with is a connection between individual museum heritage professionals. The previous site was for institutions, and it was the contribution was institutional. Here we are encouraging relationships and participation by individuals, and not only from Canada. And the last thing we are doing is we are creating a participatory space tool. We have the virtual exhibits, the 500 virtual exhibits I told you about. And they're highly curated, authoritative spaces. So changes and alterations and evolutions is very slow or difficult in this space. So what we decided is to attach to the highly curated spaces a participatory space tool where audiences will have access to museum professional and talk and have a dialogue and in the same time interact and be able to evolve, to use, to reuse museum content. So back to the economics. We have the investment programs, creating virtual exhibits, community memories, learning objects, encouraging public and private sector partnerships. We have a strong program for capacity building. We think this is an investment and it's an indirect contribution to economics. And also, we have tools and encourage business transformation and innovative partnerships. And I'd like just to conclude with the fact that what we try to navigate towards is the model defined by Claire Shirky, which he calls shipbuilding. And I'm quoting, "I'm beginning to think that a better model is shipbuilding, where the goal is to provide groups a way to gather and to go somewhere together. It provides group a way to say, we are going to use this medium, this vessel, to accomplish this goal. Ships are part space, part tools. The ways they work are quite obvious. They divide roles among the people on them, and it assumes, among other things, the group is going to come together, use the tool, achieve the destination, and then leave." Thank you.